Hi, I'm Scott Hennig, President and CEO of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Welcome to Q&A. Today my guest is John Gormley. John's a lawyer, former member of Parliament, but he's best known for his 25 years as the host of The John Gormley Show. Aired Saskatchewan-wide, The John Gormley Show debuted in September of 1998 and aired across Saskatchewan until November of 23. During his time, John interviewed people like U.S. Presidents Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, also all the Canadian prime ministers, except for one who you tried to get but wouldn't come on. Due to the popularity of his show, John Gormley is a household name in Saskatchewan. After his retirement in radio, John's been back in the legal profession, practicing law here in Saskatoon. John, thanks for joining me.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Scott. Thanks for having me.
I want to start in the beginning. John, you grew up in Saskatchewan and you got into radio very early in life. What got you into that?
It's one of those inexplicable things, Scott. I still don't think I have an answer. I'm 17 years old, 12th grade. It's February, March. I'm on the student council. I'm at the local CJNB in North Battleford paying bills because we're hiring a band for a dance. And the manager of the radio station was a close friend of my dad's, and I'd grown up with his kids. And I said to him, is there any job around here where I could learn to work on the radio? And so with no training, no nothing, they had me in the evenings. And it was literally a gopher, sweeping floors, reading a newscast or two, and then that's where it started. So without any training, without any formal education, it started at 17.
So by the time you were 20-ish, they gave you your own show, is that right?
Yeah, by that time I was in Saskatoon, actually, interestingly, at CKOM, where I've spent the last 25 years. Right. And I was a morning news reader. So I was at university in the afternoons, I'd be at radio in the mornings. And that was a funny story. It was 1978, was the provincial election, and CKOM had a 1-hour talk show at 9 in the morning, and the man's name was Raymond, who hosted it. And the general manager phones me at home, and he says, would you like to host the open line show 3 days this coming week? And I'm 20, and I'm terrified. I said, well, why me? And he said, well, Raymond's in a phase right now where he doesn't believe in politics. And the provincial election's on, and I've booked Premier Blakeney on Wednesday, the Tory leader Dick Culver on Thursday, and the Liberal leader Ted Malone on Friday. Would you do the show? And I said, well, why me? And he said, well, every time I walk by the newsroom, you're opining and explaining politics to everybody, as only a 20-year-old know-it-all could. So that's how it began, and that was a long time ago.
So your first time hosting your own show was with the Premier of the province?
Absolutely, first show. And of course, what I've joked about later, even then as today, a well-trained chimpanzee could host an open line show in an election with a premier. Because the phone lines flood, half the callers are trying to ask softball questions to support the premier they're supporting. The other half are trying to do whatever they can to make the premier look bad. So the phone lines for all 3 days rang, so it was, but it was a great experience. And as somebody who has always had a passion for politics, it was full immersion.
Well, I'm glad that guy saw some talent in you and decided to give you a shot, because it seems to have worked out.
It turned out okay. So
despite your success as a radio show host, you decided to get into politics and run for Parliament in 1984. What inspired you to run for office? Well,
I've often laughed that there are few things in the world smarter than 25-year-old men. I've often said, if that were a decision I was making even 10 years later, I might not have made it. But I was passionate. Those were the days of a prime minister named Trudeau. Those were the days of the National Energy Program, where people in Calgary were handing back their keys. We had a federation that was in real distress. And again, with only the know-it-allness a 25-year-old male can have, I would have a parade of federal Liberal ministers in my studio. And I remember thinking, these guys aren't that good. Surely I can try to step up. So, and of course, you'll learn a lot in politics, especially national politics, but it was that kind of passion to see if we could do something for Saskatchewan.
So what, being in office, what was the biggest lesson you learned as your stint as a politician?
Well, it's attributed to someone, and I can't remember who, that Canada, is a country with too much geography and too few people. And given that geography, we're fundamentally ungovernable. That was the learning piece. And it was exciting, it was daunting to know, for example, the cod fishery. that in the early 80s was in all sorts of distress. So to talk to Atlantic, Newfoundlanders in particular, you'd have the softwood lumber issues with the US and Canada and BC. Even where we thought there was some contiguous interests, Alberta issues would sometimes not be Saskatchewan issues. So, you had this amazing kind of regional identity. And then, of course, all politics is local. So my riding started just west of Saskatoon, where the North Saskatchewan River at Borden, the Borden Bridge, turns north. The riding started there, went to the Alberta border, and then to the Northwest Territories. So it was a quarter of Saskatchewan. And 69 communities, 23 First Nations communities, in fact 1 in 3 reserves was in my riding. So you had Indigenous issues, you had agriculture. It was a fascinating opportunity to learn, and again, a bit intimidating when you see just the scope of it all.
Oh, that's a massive amount of land just to cover in a car to see everyone. Yeah. What was the best part about being an MP?
The learning, first of all, again, in terms of this amazing, huge thing called Canada, but at the local issue, there were specific issues on transportation. I mean, the Yellowhead Highway was becoming, which is really Canada's second Trans-Canada. So you were always out to see, are there ways we could twin more highways, do more bridges, very local things like that. So you always had that tension, and of course, because locally, that's what gets you elected or not, was making sure in that huge array of communities you were trying to get what they needed from government. And I'm probably anticipating your next question, the end of the career was fascinating. I often, when I do speeches, talk about my very short political career that ended because of ill health. The voters got sick of me.
Oh.
But 4 years later, we had the free trade election.
Right.
And weirdly, the one province that is the most trade dependent, 70 cents of every dollar that moves through Saskatchewan is from international trade. We were the province that hated free trade. So it was an amazing, so again, that 88 election was just, I learned things in that campaign that still will stick with me today. So it was a learning opportunity. It was a chance to appreciate trying to get things done for your local communities. And it's a great experience.
So that was the best thing. What's the worst thing about being an MP?
Then as now, it's just a question of the size of the country. I mean, in fact, in those days, Prime Minister Mulrooney was fixed on this idea that the House would sit on the school calendar. So, you'd be back in the House just after Labor Day, you'd sit till the end of June. Wow. So 10 months a year, so you never could get it right. I had 2 very small children. We tried them in Ottawa. Didn't work because you're at committees every night till 10.
Right.
We tried them in the riding. So I would commute every single week, Friday, Monday, that sort of thing. So it was just the logistics of trying to be literally in 2 places at once.
Right.
That's easier now, post-pandemic, of course. The House does a lot of virtual things, but I tip my hat to anyone, left, right, or center in politics, who doesn't live in the GTA or in Ottawa or Montreal. It's a tough gig getting back and forth to the nation's capital.
Yeah, I think about that for the ones in northern BC that are, you're flying 3 hours to get to Vancouver, and then you got to fly 5 hours to get to Ottawa, and that's twice a week. I mean, it's. I do wonder about how crazy they have to be willing to do that.
Well, it was funny. We had a system. Now I'm telling old war stories. There was the youngest senator at that point in Canadian history was a guy named Herb Sparrow, who owned the Kentucky Fried Chicken in North Battleford.
Okay.
And he was a big rancher, and Pearson had put him in the Senate when he was 30. So he served with distinction his entire, 45 years in the Senate. Wow. Herb and I would often be on the same flight. He was a Liberal senator, and he was, again, a close friend of our families, and I loved him. And I remember a late flight, it used to be 157 out of Toronto, Air Canada. You'd be late, and it would be 40 below, and we'd have our vehicles plugged in, and Herb had developed a way at the airport to lift certain stanchions that he could move, and we'd drive down the sidewalk. So it'd be 2 a.m, and we'd be pivoting these things that would block traffic, because Herb had figured all this out, because he'd been doing it for years. So we'd be cruising down the sidewalks of the airport, navigating our way out at 2 a.m. to drive 2 hours to North Battleford.
Right.
and then rinse and repeat 3 days later when you'd fly back to Ottawa. And so it was an interesting time.
Well, no kidding. Well, speaking of interesting times, you were an MP during a very interesting time. You had a massive recession going on. You had big deficits. You had a prime minister named Trudeau, who you already mentioned, and an electorate that was growing tired of him. Coming up to that 84 election, PC party elected a massive majority. We're about a year away from the next federal election, a little over. Recession, deficits, polls are now showing that we're going to have a big sweep with the Conservatives.
Prime Minister named Trudeau.
Yeah, Prime Minister named Trudeau.
Destroying a sense of regionalism.
Very tired of him, yeah. So what advice would you give to Pierre Poilievre, who's going to be coming in to power likely under similar circumstances as 1984?
That's a great question. I think with the Prime Minister, if he becomes Prime Minister, be very true to what the priorities were of the people who put you there. Prime Minister Mulroney was one of the most eloquent speakers I've ever seen in my life. He was a bridge builder. He was very good. But again, this was a well-established downtown lawyer from Montreal. So notwithstanding the boy from Baie-Comeau and the first Mulroney who ever went to university, Brian Mulroney was a power broker in, at that time, the second largest city in Canada. The Prime Minister, I mean, when we got elected, the deficit was nudging $50 billion. Alan McEachin's last budget had left that. Mulroney got it down into the low 30s, I want to say 28, 29. But when it came to making really tough decisions, he defaulted to the Laurentian elites, who again, the media, and the media role has been the biggest thing I've seen in my adult life change. And we could chat about that if you want. But the media elites and the Laurentian elites said, this is the way you govern Canada. If Pierre Poilievre becomes Prime Minister, avoid this idea that you're being nativist or populist or radical or right or whatever, but be true to exactly the values of the Canadians who sent you. And a good example, and I tease Mr. Poilievre every time I see him, and to the point he said to me once, why when we do interviews do you always open with the question, will you defund the CBC? I say, because I don't believe you'll ever do it. Because the consensus in Canada, and I mean consensus, outside the real world, is the CBC can never be defunded. Ask the average Canadian, most people don't even know why we have a CBC. So you could have an arts-oriented CBC that runs like NPR in the States, might be a little government money, but or like PBS, you do listener fundraising drives. But this huge monolithic, rabid left-wing political elite structure that broadcasts, you don't need that in today's Canada. In fact, what you're doing is forcing out innovation and competition by having the government spending nearly $2 billion a year. So I tease Poilievre about that all the time because I don't believe he will ever defund the CBC. Now, I wish he would, but that's a good litmus test. I mean, there's way more important things in the CBC, but it's a litmus test because in Ottawa, he will be greeted in the bureaucracy, in the media, in the chattering classes with this is a third rail. You can't touch it.
Well, just while we're on the topic of CBC, I think you might be right that he might not touch it, but I wonder if he might not touch it because it's not worth the political capital. It's not worth the protests. Because it seems to be, despite the fact that nobody watches it anymore. Right. And I mean, that's my biggest argument on why it doesn't matter if he defunds it or not, is that nobody watches it anymore. It's irrelevant.
But again, I think, the reason that I do that to Mr. Poilievre is it really becomes a litmus test for where will you hew to certain things. Again, not left, not right, but average Canadians need this to be governed differently. So, and again, I'm not saying he won't do it, but I think there's a challenge.
I think you're right. It'll be really interesting to see, because I think that there are people who are going to elect him who absolutely expect it, despite the fact that they haven't watched it probably in 10 years, maybe more. So anyways. But they're going to have, if they come in with what's being projected right now, I think they're projecting about 218 MPs. That would mean, probably about 190 of them are going to be backbenchers. Probably half of those will be rookies. Very similar to when you came in, how many rookie MPs there were. What advice would you give to a rookie backbench member in a Poilievre government?
Gosh, I think like anything we embark on for the first time. I mean, it's always good advice, with a new job or a new career you're in. Talk less, listen more, and find the people who can give you a really good sense of perspective. When I was elected, it was 211 of 282. I mean, it was by far the largest majority. We had university presidents who were backbenchers.
Right.
Because, of course, you have that geographic thing that you're only going to have X number or proportion from the GTA, from the West Coast, from the prairies. And it was, the Mulroney cabinet had some of the most gifted people I've ever encountered, but it was the people who weren't in the cabinet for a long time. So I think it's patience. I think it's pick your targets, pick your priorities. And the learning curve is incredible. I used to reflect that in year 4, I was almost an entirely different politician than I was in year 1 because it was efficiencies. You knew, how to access certain things to get results for constituents. Even on a service call, a constituent having a problem with, a veteran's pension or Canada pension, you were just way more effective 4 years in. So the learning curve is vast.
You mentioned after 4 years, so you lost your seat in the 1998 election. A bunch of your colleagues did as well in that election. What do you chalk that up to?
In the election in '88, it was completely the free trade issue. And for us, as I noted, we went into that election. Saskatchewan's had 14 seats, since the late 1950s. By the way, fun fact, Saskatchewan was the 3rd largest province in Canada from 1911 to 1941. So when you go back and look at the numbers, I mean, we had days when we had over 20 MPs in Saskatchewan. Wow. So 14 was the compromise back in the 60s, and we can't go below that. But as our population grows, we may have more. But so those 14 seats, we went into that election with 9 Conservatives, 5 New Democrats. We came out with 10 New Democrats and 4 Conservatives. Raina Tishin, Minister of Justice, very highly respected MP and cabinet minister across the country, lost his seat to a New Democrat. I lost Don Ravis, Jack Scowen, Bill Gottselig, I still remember all the names. These were all different MPs that we just got killed on free trade. And I remember Graham Fraser, who was with the Globe and Mail at the time, wrote a book, and he actually quoted my story in the book. I got pulled over and got a speeding ticket the morning after the French debate, because the early part of that campaign, we were knocking doors and it was pretty easy. It was, and then the French debate between John Turner and Prime Minister Mulroney, the RCMP officer's a training officer. He's being trained and he speaks very little English. And there's an older sergeant glowering, so he's writing me the ticket, and I'm knowing I can't get out of this. And I've got the van festooned with posters and things. And he said to me, "You are the conservateur?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Mulroney did well last night." Oh. And I said, "Oh, thank you." Then that night was the English debate. And then, Turner hits him very hard on drawing the line and, we'll all become Americans and this thing. The day after the English debate, everything turned. And you'd have lifetime conservatives saying, "I like you, I'm a conservative, I voted for Diefenbaker, but the Americans are going to throw grandma out of the nursing home." When all the American companies buy our nursing homes. And I'm thinking, where do you see that? But every day. So it was this idea that the free trade agreement was way larger than trade. It was cultural. It was, an assault on our Canadianness. Of course, none of that turned out to be true. It was the single greatest economic policy, I would argue, in the 20th century. But try telling that to Saskatchewan voters who were very much dialed into the NDP messaging, that this was a bad thing. So that was the tough part of the '88 election. But again, like everything else, you learn. You learn a lot.
Well, sometimes it takes a bit to get people in Saskatchewan on side. I mean, even the wheat board issue was a tough one here in this province too.
Well, this province, you had proxies for the NDP, and this is one of the biggest changes in my lifetime. In '84 to '88, the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool was a proxy organization for the NDP. The NFU, the National Farmers Union, was kind of the more radical left. You had, all of these formalized structures that were there for the NDP agenda. Now you look at the NDP, once you move it beyond organized labor, there just aren't that many proxy organizations left. So Saskatchewan was always a province, and the dichotomy existed for a long time where they voted for Tommy Douglas provincially and John Diefenbaker federally.
Right.
So it was a very much agrarian, kind of rural conservative set of values, but found its home in the old traditional co-op based NDP. So that was, so free trade didn't work in that paradigm because free trade was an assault or a threat, people thought.
That 1988 election was the first time the Reform Party ran candidates, didn't elect anyone, but could you tell during that election that the mood was changing out west with the Reform Party?
Absolutely. In fact, I held a grudge with the Reform Party that lasted as long as the Reform Party did. I just couldn't, it was only really in the Canadian Alliance days, and there was this gradual coming together on the conservative right. I never ever voted for the Reform Party. I disassociated myself from them because I was bearing a big grudge, because the West wants in was the motto. And I remember saying, the West wants in. So Bill McKnight, Kindersley, Saskatchewan, Indian Affairs, Ray Natition, Saskatoon Justice, Jake Epp, Minister of Health, rural Manitoba, Joe Clark, Harvey Andre, Calgary. I mean, I could name Pat Carney, International Trade, Vancouver. The West had the most powerful positions in the cabinet through the entire Mulroney first 4 years, save for Mike Wilson, who was the finance minister. But every other senior portfolio was west of the Lakehead. And so my Reform Party, the West wants in. I said, what the hell? The West is in. Come on, stop it. But the turning point, and again, this was one of those fascinating flashpoints, and I can't even remember how it worked. It was the CF-18 maintenance contract that was going to go to, I think it was Bristol Aerospace in Winnipeg, and the decision was made to shift it to Montreal. And that hit a tone in the West, that this was yet again Quebec using political manipulation to get jobs and get contracts. And I remember we had, in those days you had letters, hundreds of letters from loyal supporters saying the Mulroney government is just like the Trudeau government. When Montreal says jump, you say how high. So that was, I think, in retrospect, probably the flashpoint. But no, we didn't have, I think I lost by about 600 or 700 votes. The Reformer, I think, got 400. So it wouldn't have mattered to me, but it was that messaging. Clearly, this was a government that didn't look out for the West and was selling out Canada in the free trade agreement. So that's a pretty good combination to undermine a young incumbent. So yeah, the Reform Party, certainly not long after that election, you had Deb Gray, who won the by-election in Alberta, not long after, and then you saw that real move to the West as the Reform Party. And I think, history has borne out pretty solidly that it's helped reconfigure conservative politics in a good way.
Yeah, it's been fascinating.
So I don't bear any grudges.
Anymore.
After 30 some years, yeah.
So after that 88 election, you went back to school, decided to get your law degree. Was that always your plan, or was it something in Ottawa that triggered it?
I had always wanted to study law, and life had kind of gotten ahead of me between radio and politics. And I remember waking up the morning after the election, and it was a funny feeling, and I still joke about it. It's like reliving 12th grade. I mean, you wake up the next morning, you literally have the world ahead of you. So I had a few offers to go back into radio, and I said, well, thankfully I appreciate it, but no, if I don't study law now, I never will. And Ottawa helped a little bit, because you'd be in particularly legislative drafting sessions where you'd be as a member trying to argue that you needed this or that, and the drafts people in Justice and the drafts people in the departments would be doing things, and you'd think, so that's how it's done. So that was a bit of an incentive.
So you went, you did employment and labor law in Alberta for a little while, and then you went back into radio in Saskatchewan. So how did that opportunity arise, and what was the drive to get back on air?
Like everything else in my life, it was serendipity combined with coincidence. I was actually at a broadcasters convention, and the legendary Peter Warren was being honored. He did the talk show in Winnipeg for decades. And he was vaguely aware of who I was based on my earlier talk career, and I was a fan of his, and we were talking, and I was sort of lamenting the state of talk radio. And all of a sudden, I'm just chatting with him, and I'm realizing, I'd been away from radio for a dozen years, so what's this about? But I would listen to talk radio in Alberta, and Gord Rollinson, who owns Rolco Radio, was at the table, and I had known Gord for years. And he phones me up a little bit later and says, "You seem to have lots of opinions on talk radio. We're looking at taking CJME and CKOM, which were oldie stations, and then going to the news talk format." And I said, "Thank you, but no, I'm entirely happy in Edmonton practicing labor law." But Gord, as is his way, kept going and going over the months. And then about a year later, I ended up saying, "Well, okay, I'll try it." And so as a result, I also worked with Gord as his in-house labor counsel. So I kept practicing labor law for 25 years. And it was a bit of a hedge in case he got tired of me or I got tired of radio, but it didn't happen. And we were able to be a part of the launch. And at that time, Regina and Saskatoon were the last two urban markets in Canada to go to the news talk format. So it was new, it was exciting, and it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I would say so. They're still going. Was it like riding a bike? Did it take a while to get or did it take a while for you to get your voice again?
A little bit, because I tended to approach, even though we set out very early to say this would be an editorially driven, opinion-based talk show. And it's important. I mean, some talk radio, it's not easy to listen to, but still does very much like a news thing. The host never takes an opinion. There's this. We decided this would be a strongly opinion-focused show. As a litigation lawyer, I was trained to always sort of look at both sides and say, okay, now here, so what side, I'm representing this side as a client. So in the early days, it was really difficult to kind of find a point of view, assess it, come down on it, and then argue it compellingly. But I learned pretty early that authenticity is really a huge point. I mean, you can't make up your opinion. I mean, people used to say to me, for years and years, "You must make that stuff up." And I said, "Well, do you understand how hard it would be to remember?" What do I think of this, right? So that's fakery. I mean, so everything I did on the show was what I believed in. Now, it was sometimes a little bigger on the show.
Sure.
If you and I were sitting down having a coffee or a beer, I might concede a little more, but everything on the show had to be what authentically I thought it was. So it took a little while to get to that, but it worked.
No, I would say it definitely did. So you started your show, the NDP were in power in Saskatchewan at that time. It was coming sort of the end of Premier Romano, the start of Premier Calvert. Was there, watching those two governments, did you find there were stark differences between the two of them?
It was really the end of a time. And Premier Calvert, I didn't know anything about. He'd actually been in the Romano cabinet back in the 90s when I was living in Alberta. Premier Calvert's a delightful man, United Church minister from Moose Jaw. He became, this was in 2000 when Roy Romano stepped down, there was a huge, about 6 candidates, and it was a pretty good array from Nettie Wiebe on the radical hard left all the way to, actually Scott Banda, interestingly enough, who became the CEO of Federated Co-op. Banda was kind of like a liberal in a little bit of a hurry. I mean, he was very centrist, almost right-wing, and you had Nettie Wiebe, and then Lorne Calvert was kind of, you could tell, was the consensus choice. But his challenge was he'd inherited a caucus and a cabinet that was a bit long in the tooth. And that's the problem. And I know when we talk about Saskatchewan, we'll get into this, governments have a natural evolutionary shelf life of about 10 years. And Romano had been elected in 91. He had Janice McKinnon, he had Bob Mitchell, Mitchell had been a well-known deputy minister and a lawyer. I mean, Romano had a real power group in his cabinet. By 2000, they were all gone and they were leaving. So Mr. Calvert inherited a pretty weak caucus, but more than anything, the NDP messaging used to drive me crazy because the implicit message was, why can't you just be happy with what we have now? And one of his ministers in the early 2000s, and actually this is what precipitated the book I wrote in Saskatchewan politics, he said, I don't know why people are so upset about everybody leaving Saskatchewan. There's more here for those of us who stay. prices are cheaper because we have bigger houses that nobody is living in, so we can all have big houses for cheap. And I'm sitting there on the radio show thinking, like, this is like a bad Monty Python routine. I mean, you are a cabinet minister? So there was this fall short, the title of my book was Left Out, Saskatchewan's NDP and the Relentless Pursuit of Mediocrity. Because this was a government by this time that, you didn't defend just the status quo, you defended mediocrity. Right. And that made me crazy. So it was easy as a conservative talk show host. There was lots of stuff to pick at.
I think that attitude is changed. I mean, I having come to this province on a fairly regular basis since the early 2000s, I've seen a change in the mood of this province in general, and it was sort of we're going to have to move to Alberta if we want to get a good job, to now a lot more pride in staying here and raising families here and keeping people here and jobs here. Absolutely.
Sense of place, sense of pride. And again, I do a lot of convention speaking, and I always go back to 1911, the depths of the Great Depression. We had 200,000 more people here than Alberta had.
Right.
We had 100,000 more than BC had, which of course in those days they didn't have developed ports and lumber. But the point was Saskatchewan was the place that was the shining house on the hill. And we always joke about Saskatchewan. All across Canada, people will say, well, I had a great grandma in Saskatchewan. My family's from Saskatchewan. Well, of course they were. This was the third largest province. Right. So somewhere along the line, we kind of consigned ourselves to settling. Alberta, sure, discovers oil, Leduc, 1949. We also had oil here. In fact, for years I did a speech where this was the late 90s, it was a color-coded map of gas and oil wells. And Alberta, along this side, is completely dotted with it. Saskatchewan has two little pouches. And I used to pull it up on a screen and say, isn't it amazing? When 500 million years ago, all those dinosaurs died and forests sunk into the swamps, how they knew there'd be a line going down there and everything on this side of the line would be oil and everything here would be nothing. And so now when you look at that, Saskatchewan's got the Bakken, we've had, and again, we produce 500,000 barrels of oil a day, conventional. Now, the oil sands is 5 million, but if you strip away the oil sands, our conventional oil production isn't much less than Alberta. So it's been things like that have instilled a sense of place and a sense of pride, and it's changed.
Well, but I'd say people that came to Alberta, it's now kind of odd to find someone that doesn't have Saskatchewan roots. I mean, it's a lot.
It's two great stories about growing up in Saskatchewan. One, of course, is the origin of the word. It's a word of the Cree people. Okay. That loosely translated means moving to Alberta. and the other part of that, sorry, this is from my speech, but the other part of that is, and I actually did an event, it was a financial planners event a few months ago, where there was a big cohort in the room who clearly looked under 40. There's about a third of them. And I said, now, I want everybody on this side and everybody over 40, don't answer this question. I know you know the answer, just bite your lip. What was the number one graduation gift for decades if you grew up in Saskatchewan? And I look at the 35-year-olds, and one of them goes, books? And then I say, okay, everybody, and in unison, everybody yells, luggage. Because when I graduated, I got a set of luggage. Because the expectation for decades was you get to grade 12, you get luggage, you move to Calgary. And that's the way it used to be.
Well, I'm glad it's changed. Not that we don't love having the wonderful people from Saskatchewan move to Alberta, but it's I'm glad it's changed.
Oh, no more than we are. It's good.
You covered the Saskatchewan Party first election in 1999. They were founded a couple years prior. At that time, did you think that was going to be a death knell for the NDP, or was it going to be an uneasy marriage doomed to fail?
That's a great question. I don't know what I knew at the time. I was living in Alberta in 97 when they were formed, and 4 Conservatives and 4 Liberals joined. And I remember at the time thinking, that's really innovative. But the Conservatives, much of it was survival. They had been wiped out in 91. There'd been the whole big scandal involving the Conservatives. The Liberals, because historically Saskatchewan, and this is one of these weird things, where the NDP from 1944 until 2007. We're the natural governing party. There were 7 years in the 60s when the Liberals became the party of the center-right. In the 80s, the Divine Government for 9 years, the party of the center-right. But except for those two 16-year aggregate periods, the NDP was the machine in Saskatchewan. They rarely got 50% of the vote because Liberals, and even Tommy Douglas's famous Mouseland parable. He would talk about the mice being chased by the black cats and the white cats. And he used to say, if you can keep the black cats and the white cats fighting, they leave the mice alone. And that was known as the Mouseland parable. And it was true. I mean, Saskatchewan's NDP from 1944 had vote splitting down to an art form. So at the time in 97, I look at this and think, the Liberals were clearly the party that had the most support. The Tories were in rough shape. And I thought, gosh, could these get their act together? I thought it addressed the historic vote splitting, but I thought if there was enough of a fringe on each side, they'd continue to split. So 99 was the shock. This party had been in existence 2 years, and they got more votes in the 99 election than the NDP did. So the NDP had to form a coalition with 3 Liberals who got elected, put 2 of them in cabinet, made one of them the speaker. So Roy Romano's last term was actually a coalition propped up by the Liberals. Yeah, so then in 07, 03, Lorne Calvert actually gets a majority. So Romano cobbled a minority for his last term. Calvert wins the NDP majority back, and then 07, the Sask Party. But I think the beginning of that death knell, as you put it aptly, was in 99. Because if a new party could get more votes than this political machine, that's showing them that there's an appetite for doing it differently.
So you mentioned your book. You wrote the book about the NDP. What prompted you to write that book, and what were you hoping that readers would take away from it?
The book was more autobiographical than a lot of people thought it was. It was a book about Saskatchewan politics, but it was a book about a kid who comes to Saskatchewan with his immigrant parents at the age of 3. Normal children traded hockey cards and baseball cards. I used to go down to the rumpus room, which was a big 60s thing, and my dad had a Saskatchewan map on the wall of ridings, and he had pins in it for the parties. And when I was 8 years old, I could pull the pins out and tell you which riding. So my hobby was politics as a kid. So I wanted to tell the story about growing up in a Saskatchewan as a political person who always felt the province underperformed. So the whole book was this NDP machine that had governed this province for so long always, for some reason, kept falling short, but didn't aspire to improve it. I mean, it was sort of defending the status quo. So that was the purpose of the book. And then what I did is I took an historical perspective, and then the last 2 terms I pulled out, kind of unpacked what I saw as some of the issues. And book sold a lot of books. And it was written just 2 years after Brad Wall was elected in 07. And the purpose was for me to explain this is how it happened. And then it was a bit of a, loath to call it a clarion call, but it was a call to voters to say, this is how you keep Saskatchewan non-NDP, but also here's how you hold the right accountable.
Speaking of that, I guess we're now many years into the Saskatchewan party's governing. What do you see in the future? What do you think is going to happen?
It's intriguing because, as I said earlier, organically governments kind of run out of steam at 10 years. The Sask Party is now 17 this fall. 2 leaders. They are, as any party will, they are feeling some things beginning to drag them down. So their choice is, of course, they have to be able to keep that coalition of the center-right. I think they will. I mean, they're still dominant in the rural areas, the small cities, they're very dominant in. They're in some erosion of the votes in Saskatoon and Regina. They'll still win seats in Saskatoon and Regina. So the old days where the NDP totally ran the cities and the non-NDP ran the country, we're not there yet. But the challenge will be for Premier Moe, who's done, again, he never was Brad Wall. So he's got a unique and very, very interesting governing style. I mean, this is a guy who, on details, I've met few political leaders with a focus on details like Premier Moe. And it's a little bit counterintuitive. He comes across as a very quiet, sort of larger rural guy. This guy is a policy fiend when it comes to details. So yes, he's done well on that front, but he has to start resetting what his cabinet's going to look like, an urban presence, an improvement for new Canadians, more women in positions of responsibility in the cabinet. So Premier Moe is going to have to move that way and then start to ask himself, because he will have been in by that time, 7 years, 8 years. So then he has to say, how much longer do I have? So it's going to be a challenge, but of course, if parties want to stick around long, they have to continue to adapt.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true. Talking about your radio show, who are some of the biggest personalities that you interviewed during your time?
Gosh, that's hard. You look at, we have 30,000 guests over the 25 years. Some of
I won't make you name them all.
Some of the biggest personalities were those fun people. I mean, just recently, just before I left, I had Jerry Seinfeld on.
No,
the first question is, I said, "Hey, I saw you in Vegas, whatever date." And he said, "Yeah, I saw you there." And I said, "Yeah, I was sitting over on the left side." He said, "No, I was sure you were on the right side." So, but Bob Newhart.
Oh, wow.
We had, speaking of comedians, we had a number of comedians over the years who were absolutely delightful people. Bill Cosby.
Oh, wow.
And that was while everybody was talking, but nothing was public. So that was a bit of a tricky one.
No kidding.
Charmian Carr, who has since passed away, one of the most delightful people I've ever sat in a studio with. She was Liesel in The Sound of Music.
Oh, okay. Oh.
So this delightful woman's talking about this, and then she starts singing, and then I start singing with her. So I'm singing Sound of Music songs with the woman from the movie. Ted Neely, Jesus Christ Superstar, hung out actually in the studio with me for the whole morning.
No kidding.
And then we went out for lunch. So, I mean, you meet these, we went through a wrestling phase. Mick Foley, back in the WWE days, Jesse the Body Ventura, but we had him as the governor.
Right, yes.
And got into an argument about eating lutefisk, which is a Scandinavian horrible meal. I argued he disagreed with that. So, you had interesting people like that, but the stories that really touched were, those stories when you met courageous people who were inspiring. So it was wonderful.
So which would be, I guess, speaking of some of those ones that you are inspiring to you, are those the most memorable ones, or is there one that you can pinpoint as one of the most memorable?
Oh, it's hard. I mean, the stories of courage were the ones, and interestingly enough, it was often a courage that came from their life experience. I mean, there was a mom, and I've forgotten her name, and I apologize. I want to say Medicine Hat or Lethbridge, who talked, and I would get her on every 2 or 3 years, about the decision to donate your teenage child's organs.
Oh, wow.
When the daughter's killed in a car crash. And it was never a dry eye. I couldn't talk to her without breaking down.
Sure.
And the courage, she was a school teacher in southern Alberta, and I remember talking to her and thinking, how do you muster that courage? So it was people stories. And, there were, of course, political figures. I think I interviewed probably every minister I ever wanted to interview. The only prime minister I never did was Justin Trudeau, who decided some time ago that I was an enemy of his people. So, but no, it was a good collection of people.
Any that got, other than Justin Trudeau, but any that got away, any ones that you pursued that you couldn't get?
There was a few. Usually they were Hollywood types. We'd hear that somebody was available. I had Bill Shatner on once, and he was a splendid, man. He was actually in the province at a Comic-Con event. So that was another great one. But, there were different stars who I would kind of fanboy on. I, even in Waterworld, was a fan of Kevin Costner.
Oh, yeah.
Long before Yellowstone, I'd been a huge hardcore Costner fan my whole life, and we would try him periodically on different things, and just never caught him. So, but again, they're busier. So.
Well, who made themselves available whenever you called was Canadian Taxpayers Federation directors.
All the time. And you want to talk about an organization? You and I were chatting before the chat today. The very founding of the organization back in the late 80s, I remember at the time, Kevin Avram, Norm Wallace, the Alberta and Saskatchewan people, but mainly Saskatchewan people who started the CTF. And in those years, gosh, I've met some terrific people who've held your job, including you. But your local organizers, your Saskatchewan, your Alberta regional people, your organization does incredible work, and the longevity over 35 years, I think, is a testament to that.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So, setting aside, we're going to take Gage out of the equation because he's sitting over there, and we don't want to put you on the spot. But who would be your favorite CTF director that you interviewed over the years?
Oh gosh. Okay, don't take this because you're way up there.
We'll exclude me too.
Walter Robinson, because he got involved in the boxing match. You remember the
Yes.
Trudeau boxing match?
Yeah.
Walter Robinson also signed up. And I forget who he boxed.
Right, yes.
But I thought when somebody in middle age can go train knowing you're going to get punched in the face, that's a particular bit of courage for me. John Williamson, who I think went on to a career in politics, they were memorable, and of course you. So it's been a great run.
Cancel culture, was that a concern for you, especially in your last, I guess, maybe decade on the air? Were you worried about cancel culture?
A little bit, but I mean, part of the standard is, and as a broadcaster now, I'll put my lawyer hat on. There are codes of conduct that the CRTC and the industry agree to, and then the CRTC doesn't take the complaints, or they do, but then they refer to them to what's called the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council. The CBSC, which used to be very busy some days with me, and again, this was a testament to Rolco, who would keep me pretty well insulated from it. I mean, I would hear, or I'd see on social media, we filed 50 complaints to get rid of Gormley. And I remember thinking, my only worry is who in our company, is having to respond to these. We never had an adverse finding.
Yeah, you mentioned CRT. That's actually something Danielle Smith, who's Premier of Alberta now, mentioned when she was a radio host, was that the flood of complaints that kept the office busy, and at some point you got to have a producer that's willing to take the bullet for you. Otherwise, they'll just put someone on air who's going to do what you talked about earlier, not take an opinion and just,
No, and the Rolco radio company, from Gordon Rawlinson on through all his executives, were nothing but supportive, encouraging. Again, I never ever in 25 years felt that people didn't have my back, and that's a great environment to work in.
Well, maybe this is a good time for this question. Do you miss being on the air?
That's a tough question because there's aspects of it I miss. I mean, I think what I'd reached was the time, and the time is to hand the baton. I'm not getting younger. I've got lots of other things I want to do, from kids and grandkids to practicing some law to doing some government relations work. I mean, those are passions of mine. So the time was right, but I look back on it, and that idea of the debate, the issues, the people, the callers, it was a joy. So I miss that. Now, what I don't miss is getting up, 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, the show prep, the day and night preparation for every segment. I mean, it's to do talk radio in a way that the listeners will tolerate you is a lot of work. So I did that because it was part of the show. Do I miss those kind of rigors? Not that much.
That's fair. I don't know anyone that had a job that made them wake up super early, that when that changed, they went, I really miss that. So
exactly. Well, it was funny because my wife teased me. She said, what time do you think you would naturally get up? And I said, I think my internal clock is 7 to 7:15. This morning, 7:02.
No, there you go.
So I don't set an alarm. I just get up.
Yeah.
And again, it's not 4:30.
That's not shocking you out of bed anymore.
Exactly.
The media landscape has changed a lot over the last 20 years. I mean, I saw, being in this position, I saw the tail end of the glory days where there was, there'd be 4 cameras and 20 reporters all at the legislature covering everything, to the days where it started to, we saw massive cuts and layoffs and the shrinking of the media landscape. Where do you see traditional media going over the next 20 years?
I see it disappearing if it doesn't change. Two things happened to the media. One was externally imposed, that was the internet. And the media was late coming to the party. They thought they were too big to fail. I mean, the big newspapers were more powerful than social media when it started.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
They're not now.
Sure.
So they didn't adapt in quite the right way. I think they could still. But bigger than that, this is my submission only, the media consciously decided, and this started late 80s, would be proliferated in the 90s, I'm going to hire journalism school grads who will report with a motive. And the motive is to advance and inform these really dumb listeners that climate change, EDI, gender politics, harm reduction is the other one they love. There's a checklist of media issues that predominate in the newsroom and in the reportage. The only problem is when you take that list of issues and you go to a person living in Red Deer or a person living in downtown Toronto, the consumers of that say, whose opinion was that? That's not my opinion. So, and then the really iniquitous part was these journalists would also, they didn't like us much because we were too dumb to figure out what they were going to tell us. Now, I'm simplifying. I mean, we've got great journalists, but I grew up in a culture where journalists, the stock and trade was trust. And trust, if you don't have trust, you don't have journalism. And trust has 5 components to it: honesty, integrity, being able to be consistent. So if you aren't consistent, you don't have integrity, you don't have honesty, you don't have authenticity, and you don't have the ability to be transparent, you don't have trust. And I argue today, and I put those 5 components of trust, when was the last time you felt that way when you turned the TV on?
Fair point.
Right?
Yeah.
The last time you saw a journalist in a scrum, you know, yelling at somebody because they didn't have a climate change policy. So, and I wish I could take credit, but Tara Hennig, who did that breakaway from the CBC a couple of years ago, she wrote that incredible Substack piece. She said, without trust, you then don't have revenue. You don't have an audience. Without an audience, you don't have revenue. Without revenue, you don't have a future. So the media on this trajectory will be gone. And that's not good. Now, if you put me in charge, let me buy the worst struggling TV chain, Global. You know, put me in charge of Global and give me carte blanche on the kind of journalists, the kind of journalism policy, dividing opinion from journalism. Like, I'm in the opinion field, or I was for 25 years. But you remember when you used to have trusted people reporting and you thought, my goodness, there's an authenticity, there's an attempt always to be respectful and fair. That's gone. So, because they won't put me in charge of, you know, reconfiguring a TV network, they will all go. And the problem will, or the opportunity will be very much digitally based services that will have different revenue generating models. And, you know, journalism will always be here, but it's going to look, I don't mean to be too much of a downer, but in the next 20 years, it's going to look a lot different.
Yeah, I think so too. Do you think talk radio is a little bit immune to it just because they've got, you know, the mode of it, or the method they get their message across is people in their cars? And do you think that is something that's a little bit more robust? Talk radio
has been, radio in general continues to do very well. Talk radio, when it's done right, has all of those benchmarks. It has authenticity, it has honesty, it has consistency. I mean, it's a trusted vehicle. Now, again, in my case, a political conservative, but you knew where you were getting, you knew where I was coming from. Conversely, somebody who might be a liberal or a New Democrat. I mean, talk radio, when it's opinion-based, if it does it right, has loyalty.
Agreed. Have you thought about, talking about this new traditional, or getting rid of the traditional way, talking about the new media? Have you thought about getting into this? Have you thought about hosting your own podcast, doing something like that?
That was suggested when I retired, but I'm really enjoying right now this life where I can dedicate myself to interests where I'm not a public figure. I mean, the nature of what I did for a long time, people will ask me what I think of things, like you and I are chatting. Sure. So I'm not afraid to talk about it, but I'm kind of channeling Gandhi these days. And I think it was Gandhi who said, speak when it improves on the silence. And I'll let others speak, but for now, I'm pretty happy not being that public figure.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Being a public figure, I'm sure you had opportunities to go back into public office, run for politics, probably provincially and federally again. Did you ever think about it? Was it ever on your mind? Something you thought about?
Not really. I was blessed to have the time I had, and again, left, right, center, doesn't matter. Politics is not easy, and particularly, I wasn't there in the time of social media. I couldn't imagine what politicians go through, so I leave it for another generation. I still am passionately interested in it. I still give advice to people, and I'll continue to do that, but no, I won't run.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, a couple last questions, quick hit ones for you. What's your all-time favorite movie?
Oh gosh. Okay, can I give you a few honorable mentions?
Sure.
I wouldn't be a middle-aged male without Shawshank Redemption, Forrest Gump, on and on. But the tell was when I was talking about Charmian Carr. I have seen The Sound of Music nearly 100 times. My wife thinks I'm a kook. Even my kids who grew up with The Sound of Music would like me to let it go.
That's
Sound
a great.
of Music is the best movie ever made.
Wow, that I would not have guessed that would be your answer, but that's a really good answer, honestly. When you're driving in your car, what's on your radio?
I'll usually try to find a talk station, or 70s on 7. It's really where my head is, but I'm an old 70s rock and roll guy. It's kind of the music that I came of age.
Okay, very good. Any book recommendations?
Just finished Nellie Bowles' book. Nellie Bowles and her partner, Barry Weiss, are the people behind the Free Press, which is one of the best reads, I think, anywhere. Her new book is called Morning After the Revolution, Dispatches from the Wrong Side of History.
Oh, interesting.
And Nellie Bowles is young. She's progressive left-winger. She then accounts in a painfully accurate and very funny way how you could be wrong about everything all the time. And she takes cancel culture, she takes the politics of division, she takes identity politics, and she destroys it.
Oh, really?
So I'd highly recommend Morning After the Revolution. It's a great read.
Okay, good. I think that sounds really good. What was your first concert?
The problem is I can't remember because my first 2 concerts were within a couple of weeks. It was either, I think it was Lighthouse.
Okay.
Bob McBride, Lighthouse, long gone Canadian band. One Fine Morning. April Wine.
All right, there we go.
Okay, April Wine.
Yeah,
so April Wine and Lighthouse were the 2 concerts. 8th grade, 13, first time I could get into a big arena by myself and rock out.
Very good. John, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, and thanks for having me.